2 million years ago, the most dangerous thing watching our ancestors from the grass was not a lion. It was another primate. At this point, early humans were not yet dominant. They had no cities, no fire, no weapons beyond sharpened stone. Small groups moved carefully across a landscape filled with predators, stronger and faster than they were. And among them was something that looked disturbingly familiar, a baboon, the size of a lion. Not a modern baboon, something far larger, heavier, and built for open ground, an animal with massive jaws, thick limb bones, and canine teeth capable of puncturing bone. Fossils place it in the same caves, around the same water sources, and inside the same landscapes as some of our earliest ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. This was Dinopithecus, and unlike most predators early humans faced, this one shared the same basic social intelligence they did. It lived in groups. It understood hierarchy, intimidation, and coordinated movement. It could read behavior because, in a distant evolutionary sense, it was reading something close to itself. Even now, the human brain reacts to aggressive primate faces with unusual speed through pathways that bypass conscious thought entirely, faster than many other threats, faster than we can explain comfortably. Whatever this animal was, the encounter between it and our ancestors lasted long enough to leave marks deeper than fossils. Tonight, we step into the world of Dinopithecus to understand the giant primate that may have shaped early human fear, survival, and behavior long before our species ever ruled the earth. Long before human beings shaped the landscape with cities, roads, and firelight, Africa belonged to shifting ecologies that never stayed still for long. Between roughly 5 million and 1 million years ago, the continent moved through immense stretches of climatic transformation, passing from the late Miocene into the Pleistocene. Rivers altered their courses, forests thinned and returned, and grasslands slowly spread across regions that had once been dense woodland. In this changing world, Dinopithecus moved across the same valleys and water systems as several early members of the human lineage, not as a distant evolutionary relative from another age, but as a living contemporary. The hominins of this era were still fragile creatures by later human standards. Australopithecus occupied parts of eastern and southern Africa, with upright posture already emerging, though their bodies remained small and lightly built. Early Paranthropus appeared later, broader in the face and jaw, adapted for grinding tough vegetation through enormous chewing muscles anchored to thick skulls. Eventually, early Homo habilis entered the landscape carrying the first traces of a different survival strategy, one tied not to physical specialization, but to increasing flexibility. None of them, however, stood above the food chain. They survived within it. Their brains were modest in size compared to modern humans. Most averaged between 400 and 500 cubic centimeters, scarcely one-third of the average modern cranial capacity. Thought existed there, along with memory, social awareness, and problem solving, yet the scale of cognition remained embryonic beside what humanity would later become. Stone tools had already appeared in simple forms, sharp flakes struck from rock and used for cutting flesh or scraping plant matter, though these implements offered little security in open terrain. Fire still belonged entirely to the natural world, arriving through lightning strikes and wild grass burns beyond hominin control. Africa itself was not a single continuous savanna like the landscapes often imagined in modern documentaries. It was a patchwork of environments stitched together across enormous distances. Dense gallery forests bordered rivers, thorn woodlands spread through drier corridors, and open grasslands expanded wherever rainfall weakened. Each habitat produced its own rules of survival. Leopards dominated the trees and rocky outcrops. Crocodiles waded along muddy water margins, and packs of predators followed migrating herds across the plains. Every movement between these ecological zones carried different risks. As the Pliocene gradually yielded to the colder instability of the Pleistocene, forests across many regions began to contract. Grasslands widened year after year, reducing shelter while concentrating animals around dependable water and food sources. Competition sharpened across the continent. Species capable of adapting to open environments flourished for a time, and among the most successful were the Theropithecine primates, from which Dinopithecus emerged. This placed two intelligent and deeply social primates inside the same narrowing spaces. Early hominins survived through cooperation, memory, and cautious movement across dangerous terrain. Dinopithecus relied on many of those same qualities while possessing immense physical advantages in strength and scale. They drank from the same rivers, crossed the same grasslands, and searched the same shrinking landscapes for survival. Over thousands of generations, their lives became intertwined within the same ancient African horizon. The bones arrive in fragments, a portion of jaw from one cave layer, isolated teeth from another, pieces of skull carried upward from ancient sediment after millions of years underground. Yet, when paleontologists assemble these scattered remains together, the outline that emerges is startlingly heavy, an animal built not with the light proportions of a tree dwelling monkey, but with the dense architecture of something shaped for the ground. Dinopithecus ingens carried a name that reflected this impression from the beginning. Ingens, drawn from Latin, meant enormous. Early descriptions translated the animal more loosely as a terrible or fearsome ape, though it belonged not to the ape lineage, but to the Old World monkeys. Even among that already formidable group, Dinopithecus stood apart in scale. Estimates place adult males between roughly 80 and 110 kilograms, close to the mass of a large male lion and nearly 3 times heavier than the largest modern baboons living today. Its skeleton suggests a creature assembled around force. Limb bones were thick and heavily reinforced, capable of supporting tremendous weight across long distances. The chest appears broad and barrel shaped, creating room for powerful shoulder and neck musculature. Along the top of the skull rose a pronounced sagittal crest, the ridge of bone that anchors immense jaw muscles in many mammals. In Dinopithecus, that crest indicates biting strength far beyond what modern baboons possess. The teeth deepen the impression. The canine teeth were exceptionally large even by primate standards, extending downward in curved blades, designed not merely for ritual display, but for gripping and puncturing, where patterns suggest repeated stress along the enamel, the sort produced through hard impacts and powerful clamping pressure. In living primates, enlarged canines often function within dominance displays between males, though in Dinopithecus, the proportions suggest something broader, a weapon useful in conflict, intimidation, and possibly active predation against struggling prey. The rest of the body confirms a life spent mostly on open ground. Unlike monkeys adapted for constant climbing, Dinopithecus possessed limb proportions more suited to terrestrial movement. Its arms were strong but not elongated for swinging beneath branches. The legs and pelvis indicate long hours walking across savanna corridors and scrubland rather than retreating into dense canopy. It occupied the same exposed terrain where antelope grazed, where early horses moved through grass, and where hominins increasingly searched for food beneath open sky. Its face would have been unmistakable at close range, the muzzle projected forward, beneath deep-set eyes capable of strong binocular focus. Heavy brow ridges cast permanent shadow across the upper face, producing an expression modern primates instinctively interpret as aggression or dominance. Even among living baboons, facial posture carries immense social meaning, and Dinopithecus likely communicated through subtle shifts of gaze, jaw angle, and posture long before physical violence became necessary. The color of its fur vanished with the soft tissue long ago, though related Theropithecine species offer clues. Males may have carried thicker hair around the shoulders or neck, perhaps forming mane-like structures used in social display beneath changing light across the grasslands. Seen from a distance, the animal may have resembled a baboon, enlarged beyond ordinary scale, carrying the bulk of a gorilla, the coordinated awareness of highly social primates, and the calm territorial confidence of a dominant carnivore moving through familiar ground. In the limestone caves north of Johannesburg, time settled slowly through darkness. Layer upon layer of sediment drifted downward over immense spans of prehistory, carrying ash, broken bone, fragments of skull, and the remains of animals that once crossed the southern African landscape. Deep inside one of these cave systems, at a site later named Swartkrans, pieces of Dinopithecus waited underground for more than 1 million years before human hands uncovered them again. The first formal scientific description arrived in 1937 through the work of paleontologist Robert Broom, whose excavations across South Africa transformed the study of early human evolution. Among the fossils recovered from Swartkrans were remains unlike those of any living baboon, massive jaws and teeth, carrying proportions that hinted at an animal of extraordinary scale. The cave itself would eventually become one of the most important paleoanthropological sites on Earth, not because of a single species, but because of the remarkable concentration of lives preserved together within the same stone chambers. Swartkrans yielded fossils from Paranthropus robustus, early members of Homo, large carnivores, and Dinopithecus within overlapping depositional layers. These were not creatures divided by distant geological eras. Their bones accumulated within the same broad periods of time, inside the same cave system, under the same changing climate. The significance of that overlap reshaped the understanding of southern Africa during the early Pleistocene. Early humans and giant Theropithecine primates occupied connected ecological worlds, moving across the same territories generation after generation. Additional remains later emerged from nearby Kromdrai, another fossil-rich locality within the Cradle of Humankind UNESCO World Heritage Site. Together, the material recovered from these caves formed a partial but increasingly coherent portrait. Paleontologists assembled the species from cranial fragments, pieces of jaw, isolated molars, and portions of the skeleton below the neck. Enough survived to estimate body size and infer aspects of diet, though large gaps remained in any attempt to reconstruct behavior in full detail. Dinopithecus exists in science as many extinct animals do, not as a complete body, but as a constellation of surviving pieces interpreted carefully across decades of study. The teeth preserve some of the clearest evidence. Under magnification, microscopic wear patterns reveal repeated contact with hard materials. The diet appears to have included seeds, underground storage organs, fibrous vegetation, and perhaps even occasional bone processing. This flexibility mattered in unstable environments where food availability shifted with rainfall and seasonality. Dinopithecus seems to have been capable of exploiting a broad range of resources rather than depending narrowly on one category of food. Chemical traces locked inside tooth enamel deepen that picture further. Isotopic analysis indicates heavy reliance on C4 plants, the grasses and sedges associated with open environments expanding across Africa during the Pliocene and Pleistocene. Dinopithecus belonged not to disappearing forests, but to the increasingly dominant savanna systems spreading across the continent. The absences inside the fossil record also carry meaning. An animal of such large body size should, in theory, leave behind abundant remains if populations were widespread and numerous. Instead, Dinopithecus appears concentrated within relatively limited regions of southern Africa. Its rarity in the fossil record suggests a lineage successful enough to leave a mark on its environment, yet geographically constrained within the immense scale of prehistoric Africa. High in the Ethiopian mountains today, geladas sit in the cold morning grass, with their hands moving delicately through the stems. They pluck blades one at a time with careful precision, their long fingers sorting through the alpine meadows while clouds drift slowly across the escarpments behind them. Their voices rise in soft bursts of chatter that echo faintly against the cliffs. Nothing in their quiet behavior immediately suggests that they belong to one of the most formidable primate lineages Earth has ever produced. Yet the gelada is the last surviving member of the Theropithecines, a branch of Old World monkeys that once spread across enormous portions of Africa and parts of Eurasia during the Pliocene and Pleistocene. For millions of years, these primates thrived in landscapes many other monkeys avoided. While forests contracted and environments became increasingly dry and seasonal, Theropithecines adapted not by retreating into isolated refuges, but by expanding into open country where grass dominated the horizon. Among them emerged some of the largest monkeys in the history of life. The most famous species, Theropithecus oswaldi, reached estimated body masses approaching 200 kilograms, exceeding the size of many modern gorillas, despite belonging to an entirely different primate family. Fossils of these giant Theropithecines have been recovered across extraordinary distances, from eastern and southern Africa into regions as far away as India and Spain. Their geographic spread reveals a lineage that was not marginal or fragile, but ecologically successful on a continental scale. That success rested on a specialized relationship with open environments. Theropithecines developed teeth and jaws capable of processing abrasive foods filled with silica and grit, especially grasses and sedges that wore down the enamel of less adapted primates. Their digestive systems and feeding behaviors allowed them to exploit resources that existed in immense abundance across expanding savanna systems. Where fruit-bearing forests fluctuated unpredictably, grass remained widespread and dependable. This gave Theropithecines access to ecological space, with comparatively little competition from other monkeys. As grasslands widened during the transition into the Pleistocene, these primates initially flourished. Herds of grazing mammals multiplied across Africa. Seasonal plains stretched farther each millennium, and Theropithecine populations expanded alongside them. Their bodies became increasingly suited for terrestrial movement, social living, and long distance travel across exposed terrain. For a long interval of evolutionary time, the lineage appeared remarkably secure. Dinopithecus emerged from within this broader history, closely related to Theropithecus, yet distinct in form and trajectory. It seems to have pushed the Theropithecine body plan toward even greater robustness and greater dietary flexibility. Instead of specializing narrowly, Dinopithecus may have combined grazing behavior with opportunistic feeding strategies that allowed it to exploit multiple food sources across unstable environments. Its immense size and reinforced skeleton suggest a primate lineage testing the upper limits of what a ground dwelling monkey could become. Seen in this wider context, Dinopithecus no longer appears unusual or isolated. It becomes part of a long evolutionary experiment that unfolded across millions of years, one in which primates adapted not toward the canopy, but toward the grasslands beneath open sky. The giant baboon of southern Africa was not an accident of evolution. It was the culmination of a lineage that learned how to dominate environments where many other primates could not survive at all. Nothing in the fossil record preserves motion directly. Bone can reveal the thickness of a limb or the force of a bite, yet it cannot record the rhythm of pursuit across dry ground or the silent coordination of animals moving together through tall grass. Dinopithecus left behind no tools, no preserved campsites, no unmistakable kill assemblages, identifying its behavior with certainty. Its daily life survives only as traces scattered through anatomy and ecology, requiring reconstruction from fragments that must be assembled carefully and without haste. The clearest clues come from three converging sources. The first is the body itself: heavy jaws, reinforced limbs, and a skeletal design suited for terrestrial movement over long distances. The second comes from living relatives, especially large baboons, whose social systems and opportunistic feeding behaviors still offer glimpses into ancient primate strategies. The third emerges from the environment Dinopithecus inhabited, a competitive landscape where food fluctuated seasonally and survival favored flexibility over specialization. Modern olive baboons provide one of the closest behavioral parallels available. Though dramatically smaller than Dinopithecus, they are already capable hunters. Field observations across East Africa have documented olive baboons capturing vervet monkeys, hares, birds, young gazelles, and small antelope. These hunts are not random acts of scavenging. They involve pursuit, interception, and coordinated pressure from multiple individuals within a troop. Meat forms only part of the diet, yet the ability remains deeply embedded within their behavioral repertoire. Chacma baboons in southern Africa display similar tendencies. Researchers have observed males spreading outward through rocky terrain and scrubland while pursuing prey, flushing animals toward waiting troop members positioned farther ahead. The coordination is loose rather than military, shaped through instinct, dominance relationships, and rapid reactions instead of formal planning. Even so, the effectiveness of the behavior becomes striking when viewed over repeated encounters. A prey animal surrounded by socially intelligent primates faces a form of pressure very different from a solitary ambush predator. Scaled upward into Dinopithecus, the implications become difficult to ignore. An animal nearly 3 times larger than a modern baboon, equipped with proportionally stronger jaws and greater physical leverage, would have transformed these opportunistic strategies into something far more imposing. Predation may not have defined its entire ecology, though the capacity for violent confrontation almost certainly shaped how other species responded to its presence. Its social organization likely amplified that influence. All living theropithecines are intensely social, and terrestrial primates of large body size tend toward group living as protection against predators and as a strategy for controlling resources. Paleoecological modeling, based on Theropithecus, Oswaldi suggests that related species may have formed bands ranging from 50 to 100 individuals. Dinopithecus probably followed similar patterns, moving in large troops whose collective biomass rivaled that of entire herds of large mammals. A coordinated gathering of 80 or more animals, each approaching the mass of a lion, would have created enormous territorial pressure within the ecosystems of southern Africa. Few predators could challenge such groups directly. Leopards relied on stealth and isolation, hyenas on endurance and numbers, but Dinopithecus may have occupied a different category altogether, a mobile primate society capable of defending itself while exerting force outward across feeding grounds and travel corridors. For early humans, survival depended less on confrontation than on perception. Recognizing movement patterns, anticipating territorial behavior, and yielding space at the correct moment may have mattered far more than physical resistance. Intelligence alone did not guarantee dominance in that world. It determined whether another day remained possible beneath the changing African sky. Beneath the rolling hills of Gauteng province, the cave systems of the Cradle of Humankind descend into chambers that once collected the remains of an entire vanished world. The rock there is ancient dolomite, weathered slowly by underground water across spans of time difficult to imagine clearly. Openings formed in the surface millions of years ago, and through those openings animals fell. Predators dragged carcasses, sediments washed downward, and layer after layer of prehistory settled into darkness. Within these caves lies the densest concentration of evidence for coexistence between Dinopithecus and early members of the human lineage. Swartkrans alone has yielded fossils from Paranthropus, robustus, early Homo, giant baboons, leopards, saber-toothed cats, hyenas, and other predators whose territories overlapped across the same terrain. The cave system preserves not a peaceful ecological mosaic, but a compressed world of constant interaction where multiple intelligent species competed for access to food, shelter, and survival itself. The significance of this concentration changes the scale of the story. Dinopithecus was not wandering occasionally through distant hominin territory. The evidence suggests prolonged ecological overlap across southern Africa during a critical stage of human evolution. These animals drank from the same water systems, crossed the same migration routes, and foraged within the same broad environmental corridors over immense stretches of time. Chemical signatures preserved within fossil teeth deepen this connection. Isotopic analysis indicates that both Dinopithecus and early Homo relied heavily on foods associated with open environments dominated by grasses and sedges, underground plant storage organs, seeds, fibrous vegetation, and other savanna resources appear repeatedly in the dietary signals left behind by their enamel. This placed them in direct nutritional competition within landscapes already becoming increasingly seasonal and unpredictable. The caves themselves reveal another layer of complexity. Swartkrans functioned simultaneously as refuge and trap. Carnivores dragged prey remains into sheltered chambers where bones accumulated over thousands of years. Some individuals likely fell into hidden shafts or died near cave entrances before their remains washed deeper underground. The result is not a snapshot of coexistence in life, but a long record shaped by predation, scavenging, erosion, and geological chance. Taphonomic analysis, the study of how organic remains become fossils, has transformed many of these scattered fragments into evidence of interaction. Certain hominin bones recovered from Swartkrans bear puncture marks consistent with the canines of large primates. The interpretation remains scientifically contested, since distinguishing between the bite marks of different predators after millions of years is extraordinarily difficult. Even so, the possibility itself carries weight. Large primates were not merely background animals within these ecosystems. They participated actively in the dangerous exchange of pressure that shaped the landscape. The geographic distribution of Dinopithecus appears centered primarily in southern Africa, though some evidence hints at extensions farther east. This range overlaps closely with the regions where the earliest species of Homo emerged and diversified. The coincidence matters because evolutionary change does not unfold in isolation. Intelligence develops inside environments filled with competing minds, competing bodies, and competing needs. What the fossil sites ultimately reveal is duration. The overlap persisted across generation after generation, rather than through isolated encounters. Early humans evolved while sharing ecological space with one of the largest and most socially complex monkeys Earth has ever produced. Their histories unfolded side by side across the same ancient ground, each species adapting within the continual presence of the other. At first light, before the heat settled fully over the land, small groups of Homo habilis likely moved through woodland edges in cautious silence. The mornings offered temporary relief from midday exposure, and many animals approached water during these cooler hours. Fossil evidence suggests these early humans traveled in modest bands, perhaps 8 to 12 individuals, bound together less by dominance than by mutual dependence. They carried simple Oldowan tools, rough flakes of stone sharp enough to cut hide or plant fibers, though poorly suited for defending space against large animals at any meaningful distance. The approach toward water would rarely have been casual. Seasonal pools and spring-fed channels concentrated life around them, and every species understood their importance. Dinopithecus almost certainly treated such places as territorial centers in the same way modern baboons do today. Troops returned repeatedly to familiar routes, sleeping areas, and feeding grounds connected to reliable water access. Paths became embedded in memory across generations, shaping movement through the landscape with remarkable consistency. An encounter may not have begun with direct sight. Long before visual contact, there would have been scattered signals moving through the environment. Disturbed birds lifting suddenly from brush, rhythmic vocalizations carrying between troop members, the sound of heavy bodies moving through dry vegetation. Modern baboons maintain near constant communication while traveling, using barks, grunts, and visual displays to coordinate spacing within large groups. Dinopithecus likely filled its surroundings with similar layers of social noise, creating an acoustic presence that early humans learned to interpret carefully. The physical disparity between the species would have been severe. Homo habilis adults generally weighed between 25 and 35 kilograms, lightly built and comparatively fragile. Individual male Dinopithecus may have reached 100 kilograms while moving within a broader troop structure composed of many adults, juveniles, and dominant males. Confrontation under those conditions carried enormous risk even before physical contact occurred. Modern baboon threat displays offer the closest behavioral window into how such moments may have unfolded. Large males often expose their canines in sudden flashes of white, accompanied by sharp vocal bursts, rigid posture, and explosive forward movement. Ground slapping and short charges create psychological pressure before violence becomes necessary. Even today, experienced field researchers respond cautiously when large baboons perform these displays at close range. Scaled upward into Dinopithecus, the effect on small-bodied hominins living without fire or advanced weapons would have been immediate and unmistakable. Behavioral ecology suggests that early humans survived these encounters not through direct resistance, but through flexibility. They likely altered travel routes after detecting troop activity, delayed access to water until larger groups moved away, or shifted daily timing to avoid peak periods of primate movement. Yielding territory temporarily conserved energy and reduced injury risk within landscapes already demanding constant calculation. This pattern of avoidance was not passive in any simple sense. Successful navigation required memory, communication, and rapid interpretation of social cues produced by another intelligent species. Individuals needed to recognize warning sounds, assess troop size from scattered movement, and coordinate responses within their own group before danger closed distance. Repeated over thousands of generations, These interactions may have shaped subtle aspects of hominin cognition itself. Cohesion within the group became essential when survival depended on shared attention and collective awareness. The pressure did not arrive as a single dramatic event, but as a continuous environmental condition woven quietly into the daily rhythms of early human life across ancient southern Africa. Intelligence leaves unusual traces in the natural world. Teeth fossilize, footprints harden into stone, and bones survive long after soft tissue disappears, yet cognition rarely leaves direct evidence behind. It must be inferred through patterns, through anatomy, behavior, and the invisible pressures that shape survival over immense spans of time. During the transition between the Pliocene and Pleistocene, two primates emerged within southern Africa whose lives increasingly depended not only on strength or speed, but on the ability to interpret one another. Dinopithecus belonged to a lineage already marked by sophisticated social behavior. Living Theropithecines, especially Geladas, maintain remarkably intricate societies organized through shifting hierarchies, alliances, and long-term social memory. Individual animals recognize relationships between other members of the group and adjust their behavior accordingly. Dominant males negotiate access to females through displays and coalition building, while subordinate individuals exploit moments of distraction and weakness with calculated timing. Grooming relationships persist over years, and conflicts are shaped as much by memory as by immediate aggression. This form of cognition differs from simple instinct. It requires tracking identities across time, anticipating reactions, and navigating a social world filled with unstable relationships. Dinopithecus almost certainly inherited much of this cognitive framework while expressing it at a far larger physical scale. A troop of giant terrestrial primates moving through open country would not have functioned as a loose collection of individuals. It would have operated as a structured social organism whose survival depended on communication, cooperation, and constant assessment of internal group dynamics. Early Homo habilis was undergoing its own cognitive transformation during this same period. Cranial capacity had expanded to roughly 550 to 687 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than earlier Australopithecines. Stone tools became more systematic in form and production, suggesting growing capacity for planning and sequential thought. These early humans remained physically vulnerable, though their minds were beginning to organize the world differently, storing patterns, routes, and social relationships with increasing sophistication. The environment surrounding them intensified that development. Predators such as leopards or saber-toothed cats presented one category of danger, formidable yet behaviorally narrow. Solitary ambush hunters relied on concealment and explosive force, strategies that could often be predicted through habitat and timing. Dinopithecus represented a different challenge entirely. It lived socially, communicated continuously, and altered its behavior depending on context. A large primate group observing hominin movement could reposition itself, respond collectively to perceived weakness, or escalate displays depending on the reactions it received. Navigating such encounters required more than immediate sensory awareness. Early humans needed to interpret relationships within the troop itself, recognizing which male controlled movement, which individuals displayed heightened aggression, or whether a group was feeding, resting, or defending territory may have shaped survival decisions minute by minute. This resembles what psychologists later described as theory of mind, the ability to model the intentions and likely actions of another conscious being. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis proposes that primate intelligence expanded primarily through the demands of managing increasingly complex social relationships. Within the landscapes of early southern Africa, those relationships may not have been exclusively human. Hominins existed among other intelligent primates whose behavior required constant interpretation and adaptation. Over many generations, this created a subtle cognitive arms race. Attention sharpened because inaccurate judgment carried consequences. Communication within hominin groups became more valuable when information about movement, threat, and intention determined access to safety. The same mental architecture that eventually supported language, cooperation, and abstract planning may have deepened partly through repeated contact with another socially intelligent primate sharing the same ancient world. For most of hominin history, darkness belonged to other animals. When the sun disappeared below the horizon, vision narrowed, temperatures dropped, and predators gained advantages shaped through millions of years of nocturnal adaptation. Early humans, without controlled fire, could do little except cluster together within sheltered places and endure the long hours until morning returned. The night landscape remained filled with sounds they could hear but not fully interpret. Then, sometime around 1 million years ago, a subtle transformation appeared within the archaeological record of southern Africa. Deep inside Wonderwork Cave, traces of burned plant material and ash accumulated far beyond the cave entrance, suggesting fire had been carried inward and maintained intentionally rather than arriving through natural wildfire alone. Around the same broad period, Swartkrans yielded burned bone fragments dated between roughly 1 million and 1.5 million years ago. These remains sit among the earliest convincing evidence anywhere on Earth for controlled fire use by hominins. The significance of those burned bones extends beyond warmth or cooking. Fire altered the structure of the environment itself. Light expanded outward into darkness, changing how predators approach space and movement. Smoke carried unfamiliar scent through cave entrances and across open ground. Heat created a boundary most animals instinctively avoided. Among living primates today, fear of open flame appears nearly universal. Baboons retreat rapidly from advancing fire fronts, abandoning feeding areas and sleeping sites long before flames draw near. Their reactions suggest something deeper than simple caution, a powerful inherited aversion shaped by countless encounters with wildfire across evolutionary time. For Dinopithecus, the appearance of hominins capable of controlling fire may have represented a dramatic ecological disruption. A troop of giant primates confronting armed humans in daylight still possessed overwhelming physical advantages in many situations, yet at night the balance shifted. Fire created a protective zone that could not easily be challenged through intimidation displays or coordinated aggression. The barrier was psychological as much as physical. Animals dependent on confidence, movement, and territorial pressure suddenly encountered a force that ignored dominance entirely. Cave systems became especially important within this transition. For generations, caves had functioned unpredictably, sometimes offering shelter, sometimes concealing danger within darkness beyond the entrance. Large predators used them as resting sites and feeding locations. Fire transformed these spaces into defensible territory. Flames positioned near cave mouths illuminated movement outside while discouraging approach from other animals. Smoke drifted outward into the surrounding night, announcing occupation long before direct contact occurred. The chronology surrounding Dinopithecus adds another layer of intrigue. The species begins disappearing from the fossil record of southern Africa at roughly the same time. Evidence for controlled fire becomes increasingly visible within hominin sites. The overlap does not prove direct causation. Climate fluctuations, ecological instability, and changing competition all shape the fate of large Pleistocene animals. Even so, the ecological logic remains difficult to ignore. A species once forced into constant avoidance had acquired a reliable deterrent against many of its greatest threats. Access to nighttime security altered settlement patterns, reduced vulnerability, and allowed hominins to occupy spaces previously too dangerous to control consistently. Water sources, shelters, and travel routes became easier to defend when fire accompanied human groups. The transformation was gradual rather than sudden. Dinopithecus did not vanish the moment flames appeared in the landscape. Yet somewhere within that slow transition, the relationship between giant primates and early humans changed fundamentally. The vulnerable species that once yielded ground after sunset had begun, quietly and almost imperceptibly, to hold its position. Across the southern African plains of the early Pleistocene, danger arrived in many forms, each shaped by a different rhythm of movement and attack. The landscape surrounding early humans was not controlled by a single dominant hunter, but by an entire network of predators occupying separate ecological niches. Some moved silently through brush at dusk, others waded beneath dark water, and some circled high above the ground itself. Survival depended on recognizing not only where danger existed, but what kind of danger it was. Among the most specialized predators was Dinopithecus, a false saber-toothed cat roughly comparable in size to a modern jaguar. Its skull and canines reveal an animal adapted for precision rather than endurance. The teeth were shaped in ways particularly effective against primates, capable of penetrating the thinner bone structures surrounding the skull. Fossils of Dinopithecus appear repeatedly near hominin remains within South African cave systems, suggesting frequent ecological overlap. Unlike the larger saber-toothed cats that targeted massive grazing animals, Dinopithecus may have relied heavily on ambushes against smaller and more agile prey moving through wooded terrain. Larger still was Meganterion, a true saber-toothed predator built with heavily muscled forelimbs and elongated upper canines. It exceeded the size of modern lions and possessed the strength to overpower animals far larger than itself. Rather than pursuing prey over long distances, Meganterion likely relied on short explosive attacks, pinning victims beneath its weight before delivering deep, stabbing bites. In ecosystems already crowded with predators, it represented raw force concentrated into brief moments of violence. The scavengers of this world were equally formidable. Pachycrocuta brevirostris, the giant, short-faced hyena, outweighed modern spotted hyenas by roughly 25% and carried jaws capable of crushing bones too dense for nearly any living carnivore. Its enormous head and reinforced teeth allowed it to extract nutrition from carcasses long after softer tissue had vanished. Yet, it was not merely a scavenger drifting passively behind other hunters. Evidence suggests Pachycrocuta could dominate kills through intimidation and sheer physical presence, reshaping access to food across wide territories. Near rivers and floodplains, another ancient predator remained, almost unchanged from forms still living today. Crocodilus niloticus, the Nile crocodile, occupied African waterways with the same patient hunting strategy it continues to employ after millions of years. Motionless bodies floated near muddy banks while herds gathered to drink, and sudden eruptions of force shattered the stillness without warning. The persistence of crocodilian behavior across geological time creates one of the clearest connections between the ancient African landscape and the modern continent. Threat also descended from above. Large eagles of the genus Aquila likely hunted small mammals and juvenile primates across open environments. Their modern relatives, including crowned eagles, are fully capable of killing monkeys and carrying surprisingly heavy prey into trees. Fossil evidence suggests that earlier eagle lineages may have targeted vulnerable hominin children, moving beyond the protection of their groups. Early humans adapted within this gauntlet of specialized hunters by learning multiple forms of caution simultaneously. Water carried one category of danger, dense vegetation another, and open ground another still. Every habitat demanded different responses and different timing. Dinopithecus occupied a singular position within this predator community. Cats relied on stealth, crocodiles on concealment, and hyenas on brute force. Dinopithecus added something more cognitively demanding. It lived socially, interpreted behavior collectively, and adjusted its responses dynamically within the moment itself. Early humans confronting giant primates faced not only physical threat, but another intelligent social system moving beside their own across the same contested land. Scattered through the cave deposits of southern Africa are skulls unlike those of any modern human. The faces are broad and deeply built, the cheekbones flared outward beneath enormous chewing muscles, and along the crown of the skull rises a ridge of bone where powerful jaws once anchored themselves. These remains belong to Paranthropus robustus, another branch of the human family that lived beside Dinopithecus for hundreds of thousands of years within the same difficult landscapes. Paranthropus followed a very different evolutionary path from early Homo. Its body emphasized strength in the face and jaw rather than expansion of the brain case. Thick molars and reinforced cranial structure allowed it to process hard and fibrous foods that would have challenged many other primates. Underground tubers, seeds, sedges, and tough plant matter likely formed much of its diet, especially during periods when softer foods became scarce. It was not built primarily as a hunter, but as a persistent forager, capable of extracting nutrition from resistant environments. This specialization carried advantages while conditions remained relatively stable. Yet it also narrowed the range of adaptive options available when climates shifted and competition intensified. Early Homo, though physically smaller and less robust in the skull, increasingly relied on behavioral flexibility. Stone tools became more refined, movement patterns more varied, and dietary strategies broader. The divergence between the two hominin lineages may have reflected two fundamentally different approaches to survival during the unstable opening stages of the Pleistocene. Both species, nevertheless, endured within the same ecological pressure system for immense stretches of time. Fossils of Paranthropus robustus appear repeatedly in the same cave deposits that preserve Dinopithecus remains, along with evidence of numerous carnivores occupying overlapping territory. The persistence of these hominins demonstrates that predation pressure alone did not simply erase vulnerable populations. Survival depended on continual adaptation, small adjustments repeated across countless generations rather than dramatic evolutionary leaps. Dinopithecus likely influenced Paranthropus through more than physical threat. Dietary overlap between the two species may have produced chronic competition over critical resources, particularly during dry seasons when dependable food and water became concentrated into smaller regions. A large troop of giant primates capable of exploiting underground plant foods could transform an entire feeding area before smaller hominins arrived. Territorial displacement may have occurred gradually, not through open confrontation, but through repeated exclusion from valuable habitats. The eventual fate of Paranthropus remains one of paleoanthropology's quiet tragedies. Around 1.2 million years ago, the species disappears from the fossil record while early Homo continued expanding and diversifying. No single catastrophe marks the transition. Instead, the evidence suggests a long decline unfolding against climatic instability, shifting vegetation patterns, increasing ecological competition, and the growing effectiveness of more behaviorally flexible hominins. Dinopithecus vanished within a broadly similar time frame. The parallel disappearance of both species hints at larger environmental forces reshaping southern Africa during the early Pleistocene. Grasslands expanded unevenly, rainfall patterns fluctuated, and ecosystems supporting large bodied specialists became increasingly unstable. Species built around narrower ecological strategies faced mounting difficulty as familiar resources fragmented across the landscape. Paranthropus, therefore, occupies a haunting position within this ancient world. It was neither primitive nor unsuccessful. For hundreds of thousands of years, it survived among giant predators, volatile climates, and fierce competition. Yet survival alone did not guarantee permanence. In the end, the hominin lineage that invested more heavily in flexibility, cooperation, and technological adaptation continued forward, while the heavily built descendants of Paranthropus slowly disappeared into the deepening silence of the fossil record. Hunger shaped the ancient African landscape as powerfully as predation did. Long before early humans became hunters, capable of regularly securing large game, survival depended on locating dependable calories hidden within difficult terrain and unstable seasons. In many regions of southern Africa, the most reliable foods did not hang from trees or run across open ground. They grew quietly beneath the soil. Underground storage organs, including tubers, bulbs, and corms, have become increasingly important in scientific reconstructions of early hominin diets. These dense plant structures stored carbohydrates and moisture beneath the surface, remaining available even during harsh dry periods when fruit disappeared and grazing animals migrated elsewhere. For small-bodied hominins living without agriculture or controlled food reserves, such resources may have provided critical nutritional stability across changing seasons. Dinopithecus appears to have relied on many of these same foods. Chemical signatures preserved in fossil enamel indicate substantial consumption of C4 vegetation associated with open savanna ecosystems, particularly grasses and sedges. Dental wear patterns suggest repeated processing of abrasive and resistant materials, evidence consistent with excavation and chewing of hard underground foods. Its massive jaws and thick molars would have allowed it to break apart fibrous plant matter with extraordinary efficiency. This transformed the relationship between giant baboons and early humans into something more complicated than simple predator and prey. Both species searched the same landscapes for overlapping resources, especially during periods when ecological stress compressed survival into narrower environmental corridors. Every foraging ground carried competitive significance. The scale of Dinopithecus groups amplified that pressure dramatically. Troops may have included 80 to 100 individuals moving together across feeding territories. Such a concentration of large primates would have consumed enormous quantities of underground plant material while simultaneously disturbing the soil through digging and movement. Areas rich in edible tubers could be depleted rapidly after repeated occupation by a single troop. For smaller hominin groups, the consequences were immediate even without direct confrontation. Nutritional deficits accumulate quietly at first, reducing energy available for travel, reproduction, and recovery from injury or disease. A landscape repeatedly stripped of dependable fallback foods forced early humans to expand their range, alter foraging schedules, or experiment with less familiar resources. Ecological pressure rarely arrives through dramatic events alone. More often, it emerges through persistent imbalance between need and availability. Competition centered equally around water. During seasonal droughts, permanent springs and river channels became focal points for nearly every large species within the region. Modern baboon troops defend these locations aggressively because water structures the movement of the entire surrounding ecosystem. Dinopithecus likely behaved similarly, treating reliable sources as territorial anchors tied directly to survival and group cohesion. This placed early humans in difficult positions. Challenging a giant primate troop at a defended water source carried enormous danger, yet avoiding those areas entirely could lengthen travel distances beyond sustainable limits. Hominins may have compensated through flexibility in movement and timing, approaching certain locations only during periods when Dinopithecus activity declined or dispersing into smaller foraging groups to reduce visibility and competition. The cumulative effect of these pressures extended far beyond simple food scarcity. Early humans evolved inside an environment where another intelligent primate repeatedly contested access to the same resources while simultaneously representing a potential physical threat. Adaptation, therefore, depended not only on strength or endurance, but on behavioral elasticity, the ability to modify movement patterns, diversify diet, share information, and respond creatively to changing ecological conditions. Within that long competition, flexibility itself gradually became one of the most valuable survival traits a hominin could possess. Evolution is often described as though it were moving toward a destination, a long ascent beginning with simple organisms and culminating inevitably in human beings. From a distance, the fossil record can appear to support that comforting narrative. Brain size expands, tools become more refined, societies more complex, and eventually, language and technology emerge from the long sequence of biological change. Yet the ancient African landscape contained other experiments unfolding beside our own, trajectories no less real, simply because they ended differently. Dinopithecus stands among the clearest reminders that primate evolution did not follow a single, predetermined direction. Its lineage pursued a path centered not primarily on increasing cognition alone, but on the expansion of physical scale, ecological adaptability, and social dominance within open environments. Rather than retreating into forests as climates shifted, Theropithecine primates moved confidently into grasslands that many earlier primates would have struggled to exploit successfully. The results were extraordinary. Some members of the lineage achieved body sizes unmatched by any monkey living today. Theropithecus oswaldi, a close relative within the broader Theropithecine radiation, may have exceeded 200 kilograms in exceptional males. Even Dinopithecus itself reached dimensions that transformed the ecological role a primate could occupy. These were not delicate arboreal animals, surviving cautiously at the margins of predator-rich ecosystems. They were massive terrestrial social mammals, capable of competing directly with large carnivores and hominins for territory and resources. This complicates a long-standing assumption within evolutionary biology, the idea that large brains and large bodies exist in strict opposition, with energetic investment in one limiting the development of the other. Dinopithecus demonstrates that substantial intelligence and enormous physical scale could coexist within the same primate lineage. Social coordination, environmental flexibility, and behavioral sophistication remained present even as body mass expanded dramatically. The existence of such animals opens a broader scientific reflection about contingency within evolution. Environmental outcomes depend heavily on timing, geography, climate fluctuation, and competition between species. If rainfall patterns across Africa had shifted differently, if grasslands had stabilized longer, or if expanding hominin populations had remained less technologically flexible, Theropithecines might have continued diversifying into even larger forms. The fossil record provides no evidence that the lineage had reached a strict physiological ceiling before ecological pressures intensified around it. None of this suggests an alternate world secretly waiting to emerge. Evolution does not move according to destiny or unrealized intention. It responds continuously to immediate conditions, selecting traits that succeed within specific moments while discarding others that become costly. Dinopithecus, therefore, represents not a failed version of humanity, but a successful expression of a completely different survival strategy. For much of the Pliocene and early Pleistocene, that strategy worked remarkably well. Giant Theropithecines spread across enormous regions of Africa and into parts of Eurasia, thriving in habitats many other primates avoided entirely. Their decline came only later, under changing climates and growing ecological pressure from increasingly adaptable hominins. Seen through this wider lens, human success loses some of its illusion of inevitability. Early Homo existed alongside multiple intelligent and socially sophisticated primates, each testing different biological solutions against the same unstable world. The survival of one lineage and the disappearance of another reflects not a pre-written hierarchy, but the outcome of overlapping pressures unfolding across immense spans of time. Dinopithecus remains important partly because it reveals how many possible futures once moved beside our own through ancient Africa. Extinction rarely announces itself clearly in the fossil record. Species usually do not vanish in a single catastrophic moment preserved neatly in stone. More often, the evidence fades gradually, populations thinning across generations until the traces become sparse, fragmented, and finally absent altogether. Dinopithecus disappears in much the same way, slipping from the southern African record around 1 million years ago during the early Pleistocene. Its disappearance unfolded during a period of profound environmental instability. The mid-Pleistocene transition altered climatic rhythms across the planet as glacial cycles intensified and rainfall patterns became increasingly erratic. African ecosystems shifted repeatedly between wetter and drier conditions, forcing vegetation belts to migrate across the continent in unstable waves. Habitats that had once existed side by side in diverse mosaics began fragmenting into broader expanses of more uniform grassland. For a large and behaviorally flexible primate, this transformation carried hidden dangers. Dinopithecus appears to have thrived in mixed environments where open feeding grounds remained connected to woodland cover and dependable water access. Such ecological variety allowed dietary adaptability, seasonal movement, and refuge during periods of scarcity. As forests and wooded corridors contracted, the continuity of those resources weakened. Animals specialized for large body size require enormous and reliable caloric intake, and environmental instability disrupts that balance first. At the same time, Another pressure was intensifying across the same landscapes. Homo erectus populations expanded through parts of Africa, carrying behavioral advantages unlike those possessed by earlier hominins. Brain size increased substantially, with cranial capacities reaching approximately 800 to 1,000 cubic centimeters. Acheulean technology introduced carefully shaped hand axes capable of more efficient butchery, wood processing, and defense. Fire use, while still irregular, appears increasingly within archaeological sites from this period. The significance of these developments extends beyond simple technological improvement. Homo erectus represented a more coordinated ecological competitor. Larger body size allowed broader travel ranges and more effective resource acquisition, while improved communication and planning likely strengthened group cohesion. Water sources, feeding territories, and shelter locations that once belonged primarily to giant primates now faced pressure from increasingly organized hominin populations. Dinopithecus did not vanish because humans suddenly became dominant hunters capable of exterminating giant baboons directly. The process was subtler and more ecological in nature. A species already stressed by habitat fragmentation now encountered expanding competition from adaptable hominins able to exploit overlapping food resources with growing efficiency. Even modest reductions in territory quality can become catastrophic for animals, requiring large group structures and substantial daily caloric intake. Broader changes across the continent compounded these pressures further. The early stages of the Pleistocene megafauna crisis had already begun reshaping African ecosystems. Many large-bodied mammals that once flourished during earlier climatic conditions entered periods of decline as environmental variability intensified. The disappearance of giant herbivores and predators altered migration patterns, vegetation structure, and predator competition in ways that rippled throughout the food web. No single explanation fully accounts for the extinction of Dinopithecus. Current scientific understanding points instead toward convergence, climate instability, shrinking habitat diversity, nutritional stress, and increasing hominin effectiveness, combining slowly across thousands of years. Population after population likely contracted into smaller and more isolated groups until recovery became impossible. By the time the lineage vanished entirely, there may have been no dramatic final moment at all. Somewhere in southern Africa, the last remaining troop simply moved through a changing landscape that no longer held enough space, enough food, or enough stability for giants to persist. High above the hotter plains of East Africa, where cold morning fog drifts across steep volcanic cliffs, a surviving branch of the Theropithecine lineage still moves through the grass. Geladas live in the Ethiopian highlands, among elevated meadows and escarpments that rise far above the ecosystems once occupied by their giant relatives. At first glance, they seem almost disconnected from Dinopithecus, smaller, quieter, and strangely delicate compared to the immense primates that once dominated parts of southern Africa. Yet, the connection remains written clearly through anatomy and behavior. Geladas are the last surviving members of the Theropithecine tribe, the final living descendants of the evolutionary branch that produced Dinopithecus and other giant terrestrial primates. Their existence preserves a faint biological echo of a much larger and more widespread world now gone almost entirely from Earth. Modern geladas weigh only around 15 to 20 kilograms, dramatically smaller than the massive forms their lineage once produced. Instead of competing aggressively across broad savanna ecosystems, they survive through specialization. Their lives revolve around grass, Unlike most primates, which depend heavily on fruit or mixed vegetation, geladas feed primarily by harvesting individual blades with extraordinary manual precision. Their fingers are among the most dexterous found in any non human primate, capable of delicate, repetitive movements that allow efficient grazing across alpine meadows. This dietary focus reshaped nearly every aspect of their biology. Reduced body size lowered caloric demands, while retreat into cooler, high altitude terrain separated them from many competitors occupying lower elevations. In evolutionary terms, gelidas survived not by expanding dominance, but by narrowing their ecological role into something highly efficient and difficult for rivals to displace. Their social structure, however, still preserves traces of the cognitive complexity associated with Theropithecine evolution. Geladas organize themselves through layered societies of remarkable sophistication. Small reproductive units combine into larger bands, which merge further into enormous herds numbering in the hundreds. Relationships within these structures depend on constant communication, negotiation, and social awareness. Males track alliances and rivalries over long periods, while females maintain stable bonds that shape the movement of the group itself. Their vocal behavior is especially striking. Researchers studying gelada communication have documented sequences of calls containing rhythmic variation and structural flexibility unusual among non human primates. Some vocal exchanges display patterns resembling conversational turn taking, producing a flowing acoustic texture that has occasionally been compared to primitive elements of human speech. The sounds drifting across the Ethiopian cliffs today may therefore preserve distant remnants of cognitive abilities that once existed within giant Theropithecine populations spread across ancient Africa. The retreat of Gelidus into isolated mountain systems was likely not accidental. Expanding human populations, competition from other baboon species, climatic instability, and shrinking ecological opportunities gradually compressed their range over immense stretches of time. Where Dinopithecus remained large and broadly competitive, geladas became smaller, narrower in diet, and geographically secluded. That divergence may explain why one lineage survived while the other disappeared. Large bodied generalists require extensive territory and stable resources. Specialized mountain grazers can persist in ecological margins avoided by more dominant competitors. Evolution does not reward power consistently. Sometimes survival belongs instead to the species willing to reduce itself, retreat quietly, and occupy spaces others no longer value. Watching a gelada troop move through cold mountain grass today is therefore more than observing a modern primate. It is witnessing the final living fragment of an ancient lineage that once produced giants capable of sharing the African landscape with the earliest humans. In the dry limestone hills of South Africa's northwest province, the entrance to Swartkrans opens quietly into darkness. From the surface, the site appears almost modest, another weathered cave system among many scattered across the cradle of humankind. Yet beneath that hillside rests one of the densest concentrations of evolutionary history ever uncovered, a layered archive preserving hundreds of thousands of years of interaction between predators, primates, and early humans. Excavations at Swartkrans began in 1948 and have continued for decades, gradually exposing a sequence of fossil-bearing deposits extending from approximately 1.8 million to 1 million years ago. The cave contains 5 major geological members, each representing different intervals of environmental and biological history. Sediment accumulated slowly through collapsing cave ceilings, flood events, predator activity, and the continual movement of organic remains into underground chambers. Member 1 holds particular importance within the story of Dinopithecus. Fossils from giant Theropithecines appear there alongside Paranthropus, robustus, and early Homo, preserving one of the clearest records of prolonged coexistence between these species. The deposits do not represent a single event frozen in time, but an extended accumulation spanning countless generations. Layer after layer, the cave gathered evidence of repeated occupation, repeated predation, and repeated survival. The mechanism responsible for much of this accumulation was violence. Leopards and other carnivores dragged prey into sheltered chambers where bones collected over immense stretches of time. Some animals likely fell into hidden shafts or entered weakened passages from which escape became impossible. The resulting fossil assemblage contains species from multiple ecological roles compressed together within the same confined space, producing an unusually rich portrait of the ancient ecosystem. Few researchers shaped modern understanding of Swartkrans more deeply than paleontologist C.K. Brain, whose excavations transformed the interpretation of hominin vulnerability in prehistoric Africa. Through careful taphonomic analysis, Brain identified puncture marks on many Paranthropus skulls, matching the spacing and structure of leopard lower canines. These findings provided strong evidence that large cats regularly preyed upon early hominins rather than merely scavenging their remains after death. Other fossils from the site introduced a more controversial possibility. Certain bone fragments preserve marks difficult to attribute confidently to known carnivores, including punctures broadly consistent with large primate canines. The evidence remains debated because fossil damage accumulates across complex geological processes, making definitive interpretation extremely difficult. Even so, the possibility that Dinopithecus contributed directly to hominin mortality remains scientifically significant, precisely because the species appears so consistently throughout the deposits. Swartkrans also preserves some of the earliest indications that humans had begun altering the darkness itself. Burned bone fragments recovered from Member 3, dated between roughly 1 and 1.5 million years ago, suggest the controlled presence of fire within the cave system. Brain argued that at least some of this burning may have resulted from intentional hominin activity rather than natural wildfire entering the cave accidentally. The significance of Swartkrans lies partly in duration. Most archaeological sites capture brief moments, isolated episodes preserved by unusual circumstances. Swartkrans instead records approximately 700,000 years of ecological continuity within one confined landscape. Through all those shifting climates and generations, Dinopithecus appears repeatedly within the record, not as a passing anomaly, but as a recurring presence woven deeply into the environment where early human evolution unfolded. Long before language carried stories across firesides, survival depended on smaller exchanges, brief sounds, sudden gestures, shifting posture within a moving group. In the African landscapes, where early humans lived beside Dinopithecus, communication was rarely abstract. It existed close to the body, close to danger, woven into the constant negotiation between vulnerable primates and the intelligent animals surrounding them. Traditional models of human social evolution often focus on cooperation for hunting, food transport, and shared childcare. These pressures were certainly important, yet another force moved through the same environments with equal persistence. Early hominins were not only learning how to gather together for opportunity, they were learning how to gather together for protection against predators that possessed social intelligence of their own. Modern chimpanzees offer a glimpse into how ancient primate defenses may have operated. When leopards approach a troop, individuals cluster tightly, produce distinct alarm vocalizations, and sometimes advance together in coordinated mobbing behavior. No single chimpanzee confronts the threat alone. The group functions as a shifting network of observation, sound, and reaction, reducing vulnerability through collective awareness. For early hominins confronting Dinopithecus, the demands may have been even greater. A leopard relied primarily on stealth and sudden force. Dinopithecus likely relied on observation, positioning, and the coordinated behavior of many individuals acting together. A hominin group facing such an animal needed more than panic calls. It required flexible communication, capable of conveying movement direction, group size, aggression level, and escape options in rapidly changing situations. This possibility gives deeper significance to the earliest roots of human alarm communication. The precursor to language may not have emerged solely from cooperation during hunting or tool-making. It may also have developed from the urgent need to transmit precise information about socially intelligent threats moving across the same territory. A single sound indicating danger was useful, but a varied system capable of distinguishing between predator types and behavioral contexts carried far greater survival value. Primate predators create unusual, evolutionary pressure because they interpret behavior rather than merely react to motion. A Dinopithecus group observing alarm displays among hominins could potentially alter its own strategy in response. Increased noise might indicate weakness, confusion, or isolation. Silence might signal concealment. Retreat might provoke pursuit. Every visible response became information available to both sides. Over thousands of generations, this produced something more complex than ordinary predator avoidance. It became an adaptive exchange between two highly social primates, each adjusting behavior according to the perceived intentions of the other. The landscape itself turned into a field of continual interpretation where survival depended not only on strength or speed, but on anticipating reactions before they occurred. Anthropologist W.C. McGrew argued that the cognitive demands of navigating multi-male primate societies helped shape the foundations of human intelligence. Tracking alliances, interpreting threats, remembering social histories, and coordinating responses required increasingly sophisticated mental processing. Within the world inhabited by Dinopithecus, these demands extended beyond the hominin group itself. Early humans also needed to read the social behavior of another large primate species, competing for the same resources and occupying the same dangerous spaces. Seen this way, the presence of Dinopithecus becomes more than an ecological detail within human origins. It becomes part of the wider evolutionary pressure that encouraged sharper communication, tighter cooperation, and more flexible social awareness. The earliest architecture of human cognition may have formed partly in response to another intelligent gaze watching from the grasslands beside us. Some absences in science feel almost physical, like dark spaces inside a map where entire worlds once moved unseen. Dinopithecus survives in fragments, scattered through cave deposits and ancient sediment, enough to confirm its existence with certainty, yet incomplete enough that much of its life remains suspended beyond direct observation. The fossil record preserves shape more easily than motion, and it preserves teeth more readily than behavior. What we possess are pieces. Cranial fragments reveal muscle attachment and skull proportions. Teeth record patterns of wear from years of feeding. Limb bones suggest posture weight distribution, and movement across open terrain. Yet the living animal itself existed in dimensions fossils cannot fully retain. No preserved specimen can reveal the texture of its fur under seasonal rain or the exact color variations that passed through a troop moving at dawn across the grasslands. Its geographic range remains uncertain as well. The known fossils come primarily from southern Africa, especially the cave systems of the Cradle of Humankind. But paleontologists understand that fossil discovery is shaped by preservation chance as much as biological reality. Entire populations may have lived in regions where acidic soils dissolved bone before fossilization could occur. Other populations may simply remain buried beyond excavation. Dinopithecus may have occupied a relatively narrow ecological corridor, or it may once have ranged far wider than the current evidence suggests. Soft tissue introduces another silence. Muscle mass can be estimated from attachment sites on bone, but exact body contours vanish after death. Facial expressions, vocal resonance, skin pigmentation, and hair arrangement all disappear before fossilization begins. Reconstructions rely on related living primates, especially geladas and baboons, yet analogy can only extend so far. Even the sounds Dinopithecus used to coordinate movement within its groups remain unknowable, lost entirely from the physical record. The question of its relationship with hominins carries similar uncertainty. Evidence suggests ecological competition was real, and some fossil marks are consistent with large primate canines, but no specimen provides absolute confirmation of active predation on early humans. Dinopithecus may have hunted hominins opportunistically, threatened them territorially, or simply displaced them from critical resources through sheer dominance. The difference matters scientifically, yet the fossils remain cautious, offering clues without complete resolution. Important aspects of its social biology are equally inferred rather than directly observed. Gestation length, infant dependency, reproductive timing, and male hierarchy structure are reconstructed through comparison with Theropithecine relatives. Even group size estimates emerge from ecological modeling rather than preserved evidence. Bones can indicate that an animal was social, especially in large terrestrial primates, but they cannot record the emotional architecture of those societies or the precise relationships moving through them. Its evolutionary placement within the Theropithecine lineage also continues to generate debate. Some paleoprimatologists interpret Dinopithecus as closely allied with giant forms like Theropithecus oswaldi, while others emphasize distinct anatomical differences, suggesting a more separate branch. Each new fossil slightly reshapes the conversation without fully closing it. No evidence currently demonstrates material culture beyond the object manipulation seen in living monkeys and baboons. If Dinopithecus used stones casually, stripped branches, or manipulated objects in subtle ways, those behaviors may never fossilize clearly enough to confirm. Perhaps this incompleteness is part of what gives Dinopithecus its unusual presence within human origins. It was large enough to alter ecosystems, real enough to stand firmly inside science, and mysterious enough that the edges of its existence still fade gently into darkness. Long after bones vanish into sediment and landscapes change beyond recognition, certain patterns continue moving quietly through human culture. They appear in stories repeated beside fires, in warnings carried through generations, and in recurring images that emerge across distant societies with strange consistency. Among many oral traditions in sub-Saharan Africa, one figure appears again and again, the enormous primate, aggressive, intelligent, and deeply associated with ancient wilderness. Descriptions vary between regions, yet common elements remain remarkably stable. These creatures are often portrayed as larger than any known monkey or ape, powerful enough to challenge humans directly, and unpredictable in their behavior around water sources, forests, or rocky terrain. Some traditions describe heavy bodies covered in dark hair. Others speak of forward facing eyes watching from brush at the edge of settlements. The details drift over centuries, but the emotional architecture beneath them persists. One of the most famous examples is the Nandi bear of East African tradition. Witnesses historically described it as a massive animal with unusual posture, immense strength, and features that seemed neither fully feline nor fully ape-like. During the 20th century, some cryptozoologists speculated that such reports represented surviving Theropithecines or relic primates hidden within remote environments. No scientific evidence supports this interpretation, and no verified specimen has ever been recovered. Yet the scientific importance lies elsewhere. The persistence of giant primate fear imagery across precisely the regions once inhabited by Theropithecines creates a more subtle and intriguing possibility. Human cultures may preserve emotional residues of ancient ecological relationships long after the original animals disappear from memory itself. Research by evolutionary psychologist Arne Oman offers insight into this possibility. His experiments demonstrated that modern humans detect threatening primate faces with extraordinary speed, often before conscious awareness fully processes the image. Across different cultures, aggressive facial displays from monkeys and apes consistently trigger rapid physiological responses associated with danger recognition. These reactions emerge automatically, requiring no learned familiarity with dangerous primates in modern daily life. This presents an unusual evolutionary puzzle. Most humans today will never encounter a violent, non-human primate outside captivity. Large, aggressive monkeys are not recurring threats within modern civilization, yet the nervous system still reacts as though such encounters remain deeply significant. The response appears older than culture, embedded within perceptual architecture shaped over immense stretches of evolutionary time. The simplest explanation may be that, for millions of years, primates themselves represented serious survival threats to other primates, including our own ancestors. During the Pliocene and early Pleistocene, early hominins shared landscapes with socially coordinated animals capable of intimidation, territorial aggression, and possibly direct predation. Dinopithecus existed within precisely this ecological reality. Cultural memory fades quickly in evolutionary terms. Languages vanish, myths transform, entire civilizations disappear. Neural adaptations, however, can persist across vast spans of time if the selective pressure shaping them remains strong enough. Fear responses that improved survival among ancient hominins could remain embedded long after the original danger passed into extinction. Seen through this lens, the modern human reaction to an aggressive primate face may carry echoes far older than recorded history. Somewhere beneath conscious thought may linger inherited traces of encounters repeated across thousands of generations. Moments when early Homo paused at the edge of water or woodland and recognized another intelligent social predator already waiting there. Some evolutionary pressures shape the body through muscle and bone. Others shape perception itself, altering the invisible architecture through which a species interprets the world around it. For early humans living beside Dinopithecus, survival may have depended not merely on avoiding danger, but on understanding another mind, moving within a dangerous social system. A solitary predator presents one kind of problem. A leopard hidden in brush relies on stealth and explosive force. Its behavior can often be reduced to distance, concealment, and timing. A large social primate creates a far more complicated challenge. Each individual inside the group carries status, intention, and behavioral flexibility. Threat emerges not from one body alone, but from relationships between many bodies acting together. To move safely through such an environment, early hominins may have needed to recognize distinctions within Dinopithecus groups with remarkable precision. A dominant male standing upright near water carried different implications than juveniles feeding at the edge of a troop. A brief vocal exchange between adults might indicate rising aggression, territorial defense, or social tension. Shifts in spacing between individuals could signal whether the group was preparing to ignore, monitor, or surround an approaching hominin band. The cognitive structure required to interpret these signals closely resembles the structure underlying human social intelligence itself. Within human communities, survival has long depended on reading subtle cues, identifying alliances, recognizing hierarchy, predicting emotional responses, and anticipating how individuals will behave inside larger groups. The mental process is fundamentally relational. Meaning emerges through networks of interaction rather than isolated actions. Psychologist Nicholas Humphrey proposed that advanced cognition evolved primarily through the demands of social living. According to the social intelligence hypothesis, navigating complex relationships required increasingly sophisticated mental modeling, eventually contributing to human-level consciousness and abstract thought. Yet, the relevant social environment may not have consisted solely of other humans. Early Homo existed within ecosystems, containing another socially organized primate, whose behavior also required constant interpretation. Dinopithecus represented more than a physical threat. It represented an external social system operating according to its own hierarchies, coalitions, and behavioral strategies. Early hominins encountering such groups needed to evaluate not only immediate movement, but probable intention. A defensive display, mistaken for retreat, could place individuals directly inside an encirclement. Failure to notice coordination between troop members might eliminate escape routes before danger became obvious. In this way, the pressure exerted by Dinopithecus extended beyond ordinary predator avoidance. It favored minds capable of rapidly updating social predictions from incomplete information. Individuals who interpreted expressions, posture, vocal tone, and group dynamics more accurately may have survived encounters more consistently, carrying those perceptual advantages forward across generations. The result may have been a gradual sharpening of the cognitive machinery underlying theory of mind, the ability to infer intentions and mental states in others. This ability now defines much of human existence. It governs friendship, negotiation, leadership, deception, empathy, and cooperation. Yet its roots may partially reach back into ancient encounters, where misunderstanding another intelligent primate carried immediate physical consequences. Seen from this perspective, human social cognition becomes connected not only to cooperation within our own species, but also to prolonged coexistence with another highly social primate lineage. We may have learned to interpret dominance, alliance, hesitation, and coordinated intention partly because another species demanded those skills from us long before civilization existed. The earliest lessons in reading one another may have begun while watching them watch us across the open African grasslands. Across the primate world, body size carries hidden mathematical consequences. Every additional kilogram alters metabolism, feeding behavior, reproductive strategy, vulnerability, and social structure. Bones record these shifts with remarkable clarity, and within the fossil record of African primates, Dinopithecus stands near the outer edge of what monkey evolution was capable of producing. Many biological patterns connect large body size with cold or highly seasonal climates. Bergmann's rule, originally developed through observations of mammals and birds, describes the tendency for animals in cooler environments to evolve greater mass because larger bodies retain heat more efficiently. Some primate species follow this pattern as well. Yet Dinopithecus achieved extraordinary size, not in glacial landscapes or northern forests, but within tropical and subtropical Africa. Its gigantism, therefore, points toward different evolutionary pressures operating beneath the surface. One of the strongest candidates is sexual selection. Among living cercopithecid monkeys, especially geladas and baboons, males often become dramatically larger than females. In geladas, dominant males defend reproductive access within complex social systems where status determines mating success. As group size and male competition intensify, body size becomes increasingly advantageous. Greater mass supports intimidation displays, prolonged conflict, and the ability to maintain social control over rivals. If Dinopithecus lived in similarly large Theropithecine societies, the evolutionary pressure favoring massive males may have operated continuously for hundreds of thousands of years. Each generation would slightly reward individuals capable of winning confrontations, defending access to resources, and maintaining dominance within crowded groups. Over geological time, these small advantages accumulate into substantial anatomical transformation. Yet gigantism carries severe biological costs. A primate weighing 110 kilograms requires far more than simply 3 times the food of a 40-kilogram animal. Metabolic demands rise steeply with increasing size, especially in socially active species moving across large territories. Every dry season, every failed foraging day, and every territorial displacement becomes more dangerous when enormous bodies must be sustained continuously. This creates the central paradox of gigantism. Large size reduces vulnerability to predators and increases competitive authority, but it also traps a species within high energetic requirements. During periods of ecological stability, such bodies flourish. During environmental instability, they become increasingly difficult to maintain. The African environments of the early Pleistocene were growing more variable with each passing cycle. Rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably. Grasslands expanded and contracted. Resource distribution became uneven across seasons and regions. In such conditions, flexibility often mattered more than dominance. Smaller primates required fewer calories, adapted more easily to fragmented habitats, and recovered more quickly during scarcity. At the same time, another evolutionary pathway was strengthening nearby. Early Homo invested heavily in cognition, cooperation, and behavioral adaptability rather than massive physical growth. Stone tools reduced dependence on raw strength alone. Flexible diets buffered seasonal shortages. Communication and planning improved survival without requiring enormous bodies. Dinopithecus, therefore, illuminates more than the history of a single extinct primate. It reveals two competing evolutionary strategies unfolding simultaneously within ancient Africa. One pathway favored physical scale, territorial confidence, and social dominance through mass. The other favored cognitive versatility, innovation, and increasingly efficient use of limited resources. For a long period, Both strategies succeeded side by side beneath the same shifting skies. Yet over time, the energetic burden of gigantism appears to have narrowed the future available to Dinopithecus, while smaller and more behaviorally flexible primates continued adapting to a changing world. Stone tools lay scattered across ancient African ground long before Homo erectus appeared, but the Acheulean hand axe carried a different kind of intention within its shape. Earlier, Oldowan flakes had been sharp, practical, and immediate, produced through simple strikes that created cutting edges quickly. Acheulean technology demanded something more abstract. A maker had to imagine a final form before it existed, then preserve that invisible structure through dozens of controlled removals. The finished tool existed first inside the mind. Around 1.76 million years ago, these hand axes began appearing across eastern and southern Africa alongside the expanding presence of Homo erectus. Their symmetry was striking even by modern standards. Some were narrow and elongated, others broad and teardrop shaped, but all revealed sustained planning rather than opportunistic fracture. The cognitive distance between a crude flake and a carefully balanced biface was immense, even when measured across deep time. The physical body of Homo erectus had also changed profoundly. Compared with Homo habilis, these hominins were taller, longer limbed, and substantially heavier. Average individuals stood between 1.6 and 1.8 meters in height and weighed approximately 50 to 68 kilograms. They moved efficiently across open landscapes with a gait already recognizably human, capable of covering large distances while carrying tools, food, and perhaps fire. This mattered because the balance between hominins and Dinopithecus had previously been defined by asymmetry. Earlier, humans had occupied the same environments while remaining dramatically smaller, more fragile, and technologically limited. Avoidance had been their most reliable strategy. A large male Dinopithecus still outweighed Homo erectus considerably, yet the gap was narrowing for the first time. At the same moment, several developments appear to have converged. Acheulean tools became increasingly widespread. Evidence for controlled fire begins emerging within southern African cave systems. Group coordination among Homo erectus seems to have intensified as mobility increased and foraging territories expanded. None of these changes alone transformed the relationship between hominins and giant Theropithecines, but together they altered the ecological equation. A coordinated group carrying heavy stone implements and maintaining access to controlled flame represented something unfamiliar within African primate history. Modern baboons intimidate through numbers, vocal displays, and rapid aggression. Earlier hominins had little capacity to answer such pressure directly. Homo erectus may have become the first human ancestor capable of active deterrence rather than simple retreat. The chronology is difficult to ignore. Acheulean technology emerges approximately 750,000 years before Dinopithecus disappears from the fossil record. During that long overlap, the competitive balance likely shifted gradually rather than suddenly. Prime water access, preferred foraging grounds, and defensible shelter sites increasingly favored the more behaviorally flexible species. Large primates with immense caloric requirements are vulnerable to even small disruptions in territory quality. A troop denied reliable access to productive feeding grounds loses reproductive stability first, then population resilience, then long-term viability. Extinction rarely arrives as a single dramatic collapse. More often it unfolds as a thinning, generation after generation, until absence replaces presence quietly enough that no living creature notices the final disappearance. Within the changing landscapes of the early Pleistocene, Homo erectus was becoming harder to intimidate, harder to displace, and harder to outcompete. The world that had once favored Dinopithecus was slowly turning toward another kind of primate. In the dry light of African mornings, modern baboon troops spread across rocky hillsides and open grassland with an alertness that never fully relaxes. Individuals groom, forage, vocalize, and monitor one another simultaneously, every movement embedded within an invisible social web. To human observers, the atmosphere inside a troop can feel strangely familiar, not because baboons resemble us physically, but because their attention appears directed toward the minds of others rather than merely toward the landscape itself. Olive, chacma, yellow, and hamadryas baboons provide the closest living behavioral comparison to what Dinopithecus may once have been. Their bodies are far smaller, yet their social systems reveal the kind of cognitive architecture that large Theropithecine primates almost certainly possessed. Field researchers working alongside baboon populations often describe a peculiar difficulty in predicting them. The animals do not behave with the rigid instinctive patterns associated with many predators. They improvise, negotiate, monitor reactions, and alter behavior according to shifting social context. During the late 20th century, primatologists Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth conducted long-term observational studies that transformed scientific understanding of baboon intelligence. Their research demonstrated that baboons maintain detailed mental awareness not only of their own relationships, but of relationships among other individuals within the troop. A baboon understands that one female has a close alliance with another, that a juvenile belongs to a particular mother, or that a conflict between two dominant males may alter the response of surrounding animals. This kind of cognition extends beyond immediate interaction. It represents third-order social awareness, an ability to track how relationships between others influence future behavior. For decades, capacities of this kind had been considered uniquely human or close to uniquely human. Baboons revealed that complex social reasoning had evolved deeply within the primate lineage long before language or technology emerged. Their behavior also contains calculated deception. Subordinate males have been observed creating distractions specifically designed to redirect dominant individuals away from receptive females. In some documented cases, males suppressed mating vocalizations entirely when high-ranking rivals were nearby, revealing an awareness not only of social hierarchy, but of what another animal could perceive. These are tactical decisions shaped moment by moment within a crowded social environment. Scaled upward toward Dinopithecus, the implications become extraordinary. An animal weighing 80 to 110 kilograms, living in large coordinated groups and possessing comparable social cognition, would not have behaved like a simple terrestrial herbivore. Every encounter with early humans may have involved rapid assessment, communication within the troop, and flexible response based on changing circumstances. Modern people who live near large baboon populations in parts of Africa often describe encounters that feel psychologically different from encounters with antelope, crocodiles, or even lions. A baboon troop watching from a ridge produces the sensation of being observed by another organized society. Individuals stare directly, reposition themselves strategically, and respond to human attention with visible calculation. That intuition reflects something real within primate evolution. Human social cognition is built to engage with other minds, and baboons activate those systems automatically. They are processed not merely as dangerous animals, but as intentional beings whose reactions must be interpreted continuously. In the deep landscapes where Dinopithecus once moved beside our ancestors, that cognitive pressure would have existed at a far larger and more consequential scale, shaping perception long before history, language, or memory could record it. Long before language emerged in its modern form, the human nervous system was already learning which shapes in the world required immediate attention. Some threats could be evaluated slowly. A distant storm, a shifting riverbank, or unfamiliar terrain allowed time for observation. Other dangers demanded response before conscious thought had fully formed. Among those ancient signals, the aggressive face of another primate appears to have occupied a uniquely important category. Deep within the brain, the amygdala acts as one of the nervous system's primary threat detection structures. It receives sensory information through pathways designed for speed rather than precision, allowing emotional responses to begin before detailed conscious interpretation occurs. In encounters involving sudden social danger, this circuitry activates almost instantly, increasing heart rate, sharpening peripheral awareness, and preparing the body for rapid decision making. Research conducted by psychologist Arne Oman at the Karolinska Institute revealed something remarkable about how modern humans process threatening imagery. Participants consistently detected aggressive primate faces embedded within visual arrays more rapidly than other dangerous stimuli, including snakes, spiders, or human weapons. The response occurred with unusual speed and reliability across different experimental conditions. Even more striking was the mechanism involved. The detection pathway did not require full conscious recognition of the image. Visual information could move through subcortical structures directly toward the amygdala before the cerebral cortex had completely processed what the eyes had seen. Emotion arrived before interpretation. The body reacted before the thinking mind understood why. This distinction matters because it suggests evolutionary specialization rather than generalized fear. Humans do not respond identically to every large or dangerous animal. Aggressive primate expressions trigger patterns associated with social threat, not merely predator avoidance. A snarling feline or striking snake activates alarm, but an enraged primate face engages systems involved in reading, intention, hierarchy, and immediate behavioral unpredictability. The reaction also appears early in development. Infants, only 6 months old, demonstrate measurable differences in attention and physiological response when exposed to threatening primate expressions compared with neutral animal faces. At that age, cultural learning remains extremely limited. The nervous system is revealing predispositions shaped long before any individual experience. Across evolutionary time, this sensitivity may have carried profound survival value. A socially intelligent primate threat differs fundamentally from a solitary predator. Its behavior changes dynamically in response to observation, posture, vocalization, and group coordination. Survival depended not simply on detecting danger, but on detecting minds capable of adapting their behavior in real time. The physiological profile associated with such encounters reflects this complexity. Cortisol levels rise rapidly, visual attention broadens, muscles prepare simultaneously for flight, defensive movement, and social interpretation. The body enters a state that modern neuroscience increasingly recognizes as distinct from simple fear. It is a response calibrated for navigating uncertain intentions within another intelligent organism. In the landscapes where Dinopithecus once moved beside early humans, these neural systems may have been reinforced generation after generation. Individuals who recognized hostile primate signals more quickly, interpreted social cues more accurately, or reacted more efficiently to coordinated aggression would have possessed measurable survival advantages. Today, the original ecological context has vanished, yet the architecture remains. Human beings still respond to aggressive primate faces with unusual immediacy, as though some ancient category of danger has never fully disappeared. The memory survives not as story or myth alone, but as inherited structure embedded quietly within the nervous system itself. For much of modern history, human evolution has been told as a story moving steadily toward inevitability. Language emerges, tools become more refined, intelligence expands, and eventually, one primate species separates itself completely from the rest of life. Within that narrative, every earlier branch appears incomplete, as though evolution had always been moving toward humanity from the beginning. Dinopithecus unsettles that certainty quietly but profoundly. It reveals that many traits, often treated as uniquely human, were already developing elsewhere within the primate world, shaped by entirely different evolutionary priorities. Large coordinated social groups, flexible feeding behavior, environmental adaptability, coalition formation, and advanced social awareness did not originate exclusively within the human lineage. Another primate lineage was experimenting with them simultaneously across the same African landscapes. The difference lay not in the existence of these capacities, but in how they were emphasized and combined. Dinopithecus evolved toward physical scale. Its lineage invested heavily in muscular strength, terrestrial dominance, large group living, and ecological breadth. Early Homo followed another direction. Body size increased gradually, yet the more dramatic investment occurred within cognition, communication, planning, and eventually technology. During much of their coexistence, Dinopithecus would likely have appeared the more formidable animal by nearly every immediate measure. A massive male Theropithecine, moving confidently across open woodland, possessed strength early humans could not match. Large troops controlled territory through numbers and intimidation. Their jaws, bodies, and social cohesion represented millions of years of successful adaptation to African environments. From the perspective of an observer living within the Pleistocene, rather than looking backward from the present, there would have been little reason to assume the human lineage would ultimately prevail. Evolution does not move toward predetermined outcomes. It responds only to immediate pressures, unfolding generation by generation within changing environments. As climates shifted, habitats fragmented, and ecological instability intensified, cognitive flexibility gradually became more advantageous than physical dominance alone. A species capable of reshaping behavior rapidly, inventing new tools, coordinating increasingly complex cooperation, and altering its relationship with the environment gained adaptive possibilities unavailable to more specialized competitors. Yet, this should not be mistaken for inevitability. Had climatic fluctuations unfolded differently, had African ecosystems remained more stable, or had large-bodied Theropithecines retained stronger ecological advantages for longer periods, primate history may have followed another trajectory entirely. Dinopithecus existed within a branch of evolution that was not failing. It was succeeding according to a different strategy until environmental conditions changed the terms of success itself. Seen through this lens, human uniqueness becomes less absolute and more contingent. The qualities modern humans celebrate as exceptional emerged within a crowded evolutionary landscape where multiple intelligent primates were testing different solutions to survival. Our lineage happened to inherit the combination most compatible with an increasingly unstable world. There is a quiet humility in that realization. Humanity was not guaranteed from the beginning of primate evolution, nor ordained by any directional force within nature. We are one surviving outcome among many vanished possibilities, shaped by pressures that might easily have favored another path under different circumstances. Dinopithecus remains as evidence of one of those paths, a reminder that evolution once produced a giant, socially intelligent primate, powerful enough to stand beside our ancestors as rival, competitor, and ecological equal. Understanding that presence changes the way human uniqueness appears. It becomes less like destiny and more like survival within a world that could have unfolded otherwise. There are extinctions that leave visible scars, and there are extinctions that vanish so slowly the world seems to absorb them without notice. Dinopithecus disappeared across deep stretches of the early Pleistocene, its populations thinning generation by generation until the fossil record fell silent approximately 1 million years ago. Yet the disappearance of such a large and socially dominant primate did not end with the loss of individual animals. Entire ecological relationships vanished alongside it. Large terrestrial primates alter landscapes continuously through the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Troops move across enormous territories, consuming vegetation, breaking branches, digging through soil, transporting seeds, and competing with other species for access to water and shelter. These activities accumulate over centuries until the animals themselves become part of the architecture of the ecosystem. Dinopithecus almost certainly functioned as one of the major ecosystem engineers of southern African open environments. Groups numbering dozens, perhaps approaching 100 individuals, would have processed immense quantities of plant material every year. Seeds consumed in one valley may have been deposited kilometers away. Soil disturbed while excavating tubers and underground storage organs altered drainage patterns, plant succession, and nutrient exposure. Paths repeatedly traveled by large troops became stable movement corridors used by smaller animals following behind them. When a species of this scale disappears, the physical environment changes gradually but permanently. Certain plants lose major dispersal partners. Competitive pressures shift among herbivores. Predator movement patterns reorganize around the absence of a once abundant biomass source. The landscape continues functioning, yet it functions differently than before. Modern baboons still influence African ecosystems in significant ways, but they do not replace what Dinopithecus represented. Their smaller body size reduces the scale of vegetation disturbance they create. Their troop biomass is far lower. Even when modern troops appear numerous, the ecological weight of a giant Theropithecine lineage no longer exists in the same form. The disappearance of Dinopithecus, therefore, created a vacancy within African ecosystems that was never truly filled. Other species adapted around the absence, but no subsequent primate lineage evolved into an equivalent combination of size, social complexity, and terrestrial dominance within southern African grasslands. An entire ecological role faded from the continent. Extinction is often imagined as the simple subtraction of a species, but ecosystems are networks of relationships rather than collections of isolated organisms. Every extinction removes interactions alongside bodies. The loss includes feeding patterns, behavioral pressures, territorial dynamics, seasonal movements, and the countless indirect effects that ripple outward through surrounding life. Africa, today, remains one of the biologically richest places on Earth, yet compared with the continent that existed 2 million years ago, it is quieter in subtle ways. Much of the great megafaunal structure that once shaped its environments has been reduced or erased entirely. Dinopithecus belongs to that vanished architecture, one of the immense living forces that organized landscapes long before written memory. Across the South African highveld, wind still moves through dry grass over limestone ridges where Theropithecine troops once traveled. The caves remain, the valleys remain, the pathways carved through ecology by millions of years of giant primate presence have softened but not entirely disappeared. Even in absence, extinct animals continue influencing the worlds they once inhabited, leaving behind landscapes shaped partly by creatures no living eye has ever seen. Morning settles softly across the cradle of humankind, and at first the landscape does not appear extraordinary. Low hills roll outward beneath pale African light. Thorn trees lean over dry grass. Wind moves quietly across open ground, broken by scattered limestone ridges. There are no towering cliffs or dramatic volcanic horizons announcing the importance of the place. Its significance lies hidden beneath the surface, stored inside rock and darkness for millions of years. The region sits within Gauteng province in South Africa, where networks of caves cut through ancient dolomite laid down approximately 2.3 billion years ago. These rocks formed long before animals existed on land, before forests, before vertebrates had fully emerged from ancient seas. Over immense spans of geological time, water dissolved chambers through the stone, creating underground passages that later became traps, shelters, dens, and repositories of deep history. The entrances to caves, such as Swartkrans, appear almost modest against the surrounding terrain. A person can stand at the threshold and look across a landscape that still resembles parts of the ancient environments where early hominins moved. Grassland opens into patches of brush and woodland. Birds circle overhead. Dry earth carries the scent of dust and vegetation warmed by sunlight. The atmosphere feels quiet enough that it becomes difficult to separate present from past completely. Within a space small enough to cross in minutes, multiple evolutionary worlds once overlapped. Dinopithecus moved through these hills. Paranthropus foraged nearby with its massive jaws adapted for grinding resistant plant material. Early Homo carried stone tools across the same ground and eventually learned to control fire within the surrounding cave systems. Leopards dragged prey into darkness below the surface. Hyenas scavenged the remains. Generations passed through the area for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving fragments of themselves behind. What makes Swartkrans extraordinary is not simply the number of fossils recovered there, but the compression of time the site represents. Millions of years of evolutionary history accumulated layer upon layer inside a single hillside. Bones, separated by vast stretches of time, rest within meters of one another. Entire chapters of human origins lie folded into stone chambers, small enough to illuminate with a handheld lamp. Despite its scientific importance, the cradle of humankind receives relatively few visitors compared with more visually dramatic historical sites. The landscape does not overwhelm the senses immediately. Its power emerges slowly through understanding. A shallow depression in rock may contain sediments older than human civilization by orders of magnitude. A narrow cave passage may hold evidence of the earliest controlled fire known anywhere on Earth. Paleontologists continue excavating these systems today, carefully brushing sediment from deposits that have not yet surrendered all their contents. New fossils still emerge from Swartkrans. Teeth, bone fragments, and traces of ancient life continue altering scientific understanding of the species that once inhabited the region. The story remains unfinished. Somewhere within those deposits, more remnants of Dinopithecus likely still wait in darkness, preserved within stone that formed before complex life existed at all. The creature itself vanished 1 million years ago, yet the landscape where it lived continues speaking quietly through the caves beneath the South African hills. Long before humans reshaped rivers, leveled forests, or carried artificial light into the night, survival depended on a quieter discipline. Attention itself was once a form of shelter. The earliest members of our lineage moved through landscapes where safety could dissolve in seconds, where every open clearing carried uncertainty, and where the difference between living and dying often rested on noticing movement before movement noticed them. Modern life is built upon assumptions of control. Cities rise where wilderness once stood. Most people pass through entire lives without seriously considering the possibility of being hunted by another animal. The human species now occupies a position so dominant that it can feel permanent, almost natural, as though intelligence inevitably led to mastery. Yet, across the vast duration of hominin evolution, this condition is astonishingly recent. For millions of years, being human meant existing inside food chains rather than above them. Early Homo, Australopithecus, and Paranthropus lived in environments where large cats, crocodiles, raptors, hyenas, and socially organized primates imposed constant pressure on daily movement. A water source was never simply water. Tall grass was never only vegetation. The landscape carried overlapping territories of danger that had to be interpreted continuously. This reality shaped more than anatomy. It shaped perception itself. A nervous system exposed to persistent predation does not merely react to threats once they appear. It learns to anticipate possibility. Vigilance becomes habitual. The mind begins projecting outcomes ahead of direct evidence because hesitation carries consequences. What modern psychology often classifies as anxiety or hyperawareness may descend partly from cognitive systems built for worlds where overlooking a subtle signal could end a lineage. The philosopher Albert Camus described existence through abstract confrontation with meaninglessness. Yet, for ancient hominins, the confrontation was immediate and material. Life was not debated in isolation from physical vulnerability. It unfolded beneath the awareness that something stronger, faster, or socially coordinated might already be nearby. Consciousness developed not in protected distance from nature, but within intimate exposure to it. Dinopithecus belonged to that pressure. Unlike solitary predators, it represented intelligence observing intelligence. Early humans were not merely avoiding claws or teeth, they were navigating another social mind, another primate, capable of reading posture, hesitation, and movement. Survival required interpreting intentions across species boundaries. A defensive display had to be recognized before escalation. Group positioning had to be understood before encirclement became possible. Fear in such circumstances was not irrational, it was information. The traces of those ancient conditions may still remain embedded within human psychology. Elevated heart rate in uncertain social situations, sensitivity to facial expressions, discomfort with being watched from a distance, instinctive scanning of unfamiliar environments. These reactions emerge from nervous systems shaped across epochs where awareness preserved life. Even during sleep, the human brain remains unusually responsive to sound and movement compared with many large mammals. Total relaxation was rarely safe for long. Human beings eventually escaped the ecological position of prey. Fire, cooperation, language, tools, and cumulative culture transformed the balance irreversibly. Yet, evolution does not erase old architectures simply because environments change quickly. The emotional machinery forged under predation persists long after the predators vanish. Dinopithecus disappeared 1 million years ago, but the kind of mind that survived alongside it still exists inside us, alert beneath the surface, listening for dangers that modern landscapes no longer fully contain. There are evenings in the South African highveld when the wind moves softly through dry grass and thorn trees, and the landscape seems almost empty. No giant primates move across the hills anymore. No Theropithecine calls rise from the cave entrances. The valleys surrounding Swartkrans hold cattle fences, dirt roads, scattered brush, and long stretches of stillness beneath enormous skies. Yet beneath that quiet ground rests the residue of lives that once unfolded there with urgency and consequence. Dinopithecus was real. Its bones remain embedded in dolomite sediments beside the remains of early humans, antelope, cats, hyenas, and burned fragments of ancient fire. It occupied the same water sources, crossed the same open woodland, and watched the same horizons as our ancestors. For hundreds of thousands of years, two intelligent primates shared a compressed and dangerous world together. The encounter between them left no written memory. Nothing in the caves preserves a spoken warning, a cry at dusk, or the sound of movement in grass before dawn. Fossils reduce entire lives to fragments of enamel and stone-colored bone, yet the silence surrounding those remains does not erase their significance. It sharpens it. The caves record proximity. They record overlap. They record that early humans did not emerge alone into empty landscapes waiting to be inherited. Dinopithecus vanished approximately 1 million years ago. Its disappearance was gradual enough that no single generation would have understood what was happening. Populations likely thinned valley by valley, season by season, until the lineage simply ceased to return. The landscapes continued without it. Rain still fell across the highveld. Grass still emerged after fire. Leopards still moved through the trees. But one form of intelligence had been removed from the system forever. Most people alive today have never heard the name Dinopithecus. Entire civilizations have risen and disappeared in the span since its extinction. Languages, religions, nations, and cities emerged unimaginably later, yet the influence of that ancient animal may still persist indirectly within the species that survived beside it. The capacities that became central to human existence, rapid threat assessment, coalition building, sensitivity to gaze and posture, the instinctive reading of social tension, were shaped in environments where understanding another primate mind could preserve life. The Gelada remains in the Ethiopian highlands as the last living thread of that once expansive lineage. Small groups graze quietly through mountain meadows, using delicate fingers to pluck individual grass blades, one at a time. Their existence feels strangely distant from the giant forms that once occupied southern Africa. Yet evolution often survives through reduction rather than conquest. What remains is rarely the most imposing version of a lineage. It is the version able to endure changing conditions longest. The bones at Swartkrans still wait beneath layers of earth not yet excavated. Each field season reveals new fragments, new wear patterns on teeth, new traces of movement and injury and survival. The story remains incomplete, suspended between discovery and absence. And somewhere beneath conscious thought, inside the older architecture of the nervous system, a particular alertness still survives. Not a memory in words, but a reflexive recognition that another intelligence may be nearby, watching quietly from beyond the edge of light.